Hello? Oh, yeah.
Hello. Hi.
Hey. Right. We'll see who else ends up joining in. Should probably repost the link just as a reminder. Yeah, sorry, time zones are a bit complicated.
Yeah, especially because I think it's GMT, and then it changes depending if it's daylight saving time or not. And
oh yeah, okay, yeah, that's a good point. I probably should have used
so
UTC as a consistent
I think
thing.
it's the same when you're like in a different. I'm in a different time zone, so it's I'm not. I always forget if it's 1 or 2 hours off for me.
Oh right, yeah. Yeah. Let me try and see. So I put together 1 or 2 questions as well, just to be on the safe side, because I wasn't sure how many other people were gonna remember to do that, but I think we've got sort of a reasonable amount of stuff. Oh, cool! We've got a reasonable size group today.
Oh, so we're 5 people.
Maybe more, depending on who else joins. By the way, hey everyone, so we have a kind of general Google Doc that we kind of use, which we've kind of put questions and answers and stuff into. If people want access to that, just give me their email address in the chat and I'll add you to the thing. But otherwise, yeah, it's only if you're interested. Cool. Well, while we're waiting for Tony, maybe we can go around the room a little bit and just see who else is here today. If you want to chime in with sort of a little bit about yourself and what you're using Fulcro for. If not, then, don't feel obligated. I'm happy to start. I'm Nilu, and I just basically use it we have a product which we basically built for some server-side development, and we've been using it for that. It's primarily to do data fetching and analysis. So yeah, it's more of a prototype than anything else, and we're sort of seeing whether or not how it is and how it works. So still very much a beginner in using it myself. Anyone else? Otherwise, happy to just wait.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Henry. I live up in Scotland. I'm from Belgium. I'm not using Fulcro at the moment, but I used Fulcro and Clojure a couple of years ago. I had a whole Clojure phase, and I stayed in touch with Tony. So he told me this meeting was happening today because I've been getting back into Clojure a bit lately. So I thought I would join and kind of listen in. I don't know if I'll be able to stay for the whole thing, but yeah, I'm pretty looking forward to it.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, so my name is Daniel. I'm from Switzerland, but currently I'm working at a startup in Berlin, and we are using Fulcro to, we actually just started 3 months ago, building a platform for venture capitalist funds so they could connect their companies with external providers of services. And actually, we're just shipping the first version of it today. After only 3 months. So that has been a really impressively short time for us because our last product took a lot longer than this to build. And yeah, so I'm having by now a little bit of experience with Fulcro, but yeah, still looking forward to learning more about it and really enjoying it so far.
Cool.
Hey, this is Alex from Vancouver. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Great. I'm a beginner programmer. Been programming for years, but just getting back to it after many years of being away. And I was intrigued by Fulcro, and I spent some time doing Reframe, and thought that the Fulcro end-to-end server full stack story was very interesting, and so that's what I'm looking at right now. So happy to be here, and thank you for organizing this today.
No problem. Thanks everyone for coming as well. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Tristan. I live in Geneva in Switzerland, and I'm using Fulcro right now because I'm contributing to DataHike, which is an open source alternative to Datomic, and we would like to build a front end for DataHike, basically. So that's what I started doing, like I guess like 1 month ago, and now I'm doing something else. But yeah, I'm still learning Fulcro, basically.
Cool. Thanks, Chris.
I'm sorry, what did you say the name of your open source alternative to Datomic was? It's quite
It's
interesting.
called DataHike.
DataHike. Oh, right. Yeah, I think I've heard of it. Oh, awesome.
Hey there.
Oh, hey, Tony.
Hey.
We're just kind of going around the room and having people who want to introduce themselves do so. But
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was expecting this to be in an hour, so.
Yeah, sorry. It seems like time zones kind of fiddled around a little bit. Sorry about that.
Well, I mean,
are you still okay, by the way,
3
for time
p.m.
now?
GMT, right?
Yeah, GMT.
So it is an hour early. We just decided you needed to meet early.
Oh, no. It's 4 p.m. GMT right now.
That's not what Google says.
I live up in Scotland and I can confirm it's 4 p.m. GMT.
That's weird. Why is Google telling me it's 3:09 Greenwich Mean Time, July 29th, 2020? I just typed, what time is it GMT into Google? That's what it says.
Oh wait, I think it's 4 p.m. BST, which is British summertime. GMT
British
doesn't
summertime.
mean summer. So you're right. It is 3 p.m. GMT and it's 4 p.m.
Oh,
BST.
dear. Sorry about that, then.
Use the right time zone name.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dear. Okay. Yeah, I forgot about that. That they diverge at that point. That's really irritating. Sorry about that, everyone. Yeah. So we've. I don't know if there's anyone else who wants to drop in with their introduction. If not, then anyone.
I can introduce myself a bit.
Sure.
Hi, my name's Luke. I'm a PhD student in computational linguistics. As part of my research agenda, I need to build like a kind of complicated single-page app, and I went down a rabbit hole of how do I do this with a tech stack that'll let me do this as one person, and Fulcro with Crux is where I've landed. I'm a few weeks into building my app, and it's been going really well so far.
Great. Is there anyone else? If not, then
Yeah,
I'm happy to turn over to any. Okay.
Hi, my name's Richard. I'm based in the UK. I'm just starting with Fulcro, just reading through the book and starting with a small project.
Great. Okay. I think that's covered everyone, if I'm not mistaken. If not, I think it's over to you, Tony.
Over to me. Oh, I'm running this.
Well, I mean, if you, I wasn't. So one thing is, I don't know how much time you have, especially considering the time shift and stuff. So I figured it might be kind of worthwhile just to kind of have you kind of give us an idea of like how much time you have and stuff like that, and then what you might want to cover, if anything. Otherwise, we can do a Q&A,
Sure.
Or kind of go through other stuff.
Yeah, so I'm somewhat flexible on time. I mean, I was planning on starting at an hour from now, so I probably have 2 hours. I could throw in. Since I managed to get up early this morning, earlier than usual. I've already actually taken the dog on her walk and such. So yeah, that's about how much time I have. And then in terms of my experience, I used to teach for a living, and my experience with having this kind of group and this kind of session is that you need to be a little careful with the going down a rabbit hole of somebody's specific code.
Mm-hmm.
So I would encourage participants to just think about if you've got some. I'm glad to go into conceptual stuff and show you around source code of things if you want, but if somebody has some like bug they were hoping to ask about, I would encourage you not to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I've got this thing and it doesn't work right. Could you help me figure it out? I don't think that's going to be particularly great for the other participants. So yeah, try not to treat this as a programming consulting session and more as you're trying to learn Fulcro and there's some conceptual thing or some what is this namespace supposed to do? What's the point here? That sort of thing. That's probably the best use of my time for you coming from my perspective.
Yep, that makes complete sense. I did. I don't know who has, if anyone. I certainly prepared 1 or 2 questions. I didn't do too many because I wasn't sure if that was going to be a lot or a little. But I did ask I did ask kind of in general for people to prepare questions. So if anyone else wants to jump in with questions, then please do so. If not, I have one that I can start with, and then we can kind of go from there. No? Okay, I'll start with mine and then we'll go from there. And certainly I have others if no one prepared questions. So one of the things I've been really interested in is actually in the Fulcro guide. And I don't know if this is documented somewhere, but you have these very nice live interactive examples. And I think that it would be really, really good if you could kind of go through how someone makes that, because fundamentally, I think for the purposes of people in general wanting to create things like blog posts, or people wanting to create, documentation for their companies and organizations, that sort of thing is going to be a really, really useful thing for people to know how to do.
So just like generating an ASCII doc with embedded Fulcro
Yeah, ASCII,
things.
Markdown. Yeah, because being able, I mean that inspector tool and being able to kind of load the database and everything, and then kind of click the application and make it work in that way as like a self-contained mini application is just like, it just seems like a really, really powerful kind of thing that you can kind of show off from the Fulcro perspective of being useful. And
Yeah,
I
so
was really curious as to how hard it is to make that.
it's not hard at all. So essentially the way I wrote that, the source is there. The Fulcro Developers Guide is a Git repository that you can go and look at and see the source of it. So I made a little macro that would wrap a particular example for me in an application. So it would emit the application in the atom and so on and so forth. And then you could set your own, private networking here. I could just share my screen and
So it's a little bit like a workspaces card in a way, and that's encapsulated.
Exactly. It's much less powerful, but the whole point was just to have a simple like def example. Like here's the example root, and it assumes you're going to give it some initial state and such. So I've got this def example macro, and if you look for, oh, it's still indexing. The usages of that basically, where's the main here? I basically, include all the namespaces that have the demos, and then there's a def example for each example with its title, its root, and then a div name to mount it on, and then additional options like remotes to use. So, each example in the book needs to have its own private remote and its own private API. So the idea is I wanted each of the examples in the book at least to have kind of as much as possible its own private thing. The resolver system, I think I'm using the same path home parser on all of it. So actually technically it's one parser for the entire page. So if you define multi-methods, they all technically have access to the API of those things. So I'm careful to try to kind of namespace things. But then just in the ASCII doc over here at the end of the doc, I've just got, I just embed the book. And then at each example, there's one JavaScript file with a bunch of different Fulcro applications in it. And so then if you look at, right, so an example is basically, oh, right. And then I exported this book main focus function. So that's in that main namespace as well. And so this focus function is what figures out what the app's ID is to tell the inspector, inspect that one.
Right.
So that's how the focus button works. So each one's just literally an embedded little snippet of HTML with a known ID. And then over in the main, there's a def example that will have that ID. And so that it just, this def example macro just makes the app, makes a wrapper root, and then mounts it on the node and the UI in HTML with this ID. That's really it.
Right. Okay. I'm just going to quickly look. I'm assuming that it's, I think you mentioned it's all public, right? Because the book itself is public as well. Great. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going
this is just in the,
in that case. It seems like it'll be super useful to kind of set that aside as like a, here's how to do this kind of thing.
It's just, yeah, this repository. In fact, Luke sent me some patches just the other day.
Oh, okay. Great. Okay, that sounds really cool. Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in with one?
Sure, I have a question for Tony. First of all, Tony, thank you so much for all of the great documentation for developers. It's like gold to have you talking about this. And I don't know if I've ever been on another project that's had so much great documentation. So thank you so much for that effort. It really, for developers, it comes in so helpful. I've been working with little bit with Fulcro Rad and I noticed that there was a Fulcro Rad video on YouTube at one point, and it's not there anymore. And I'm wondering if that's if you're going to replace it with a new video or.
Yeah, my time is just really limited right now. I'm running a consultancy and a startup and a two startups actually, and yeah, I'm busy. So my open source contributions have kind of fallen off for the moment, unless it's something I actually need for one of those. So, you know, Rad, I mean, I am still doing, you know, releases and updates of things, mainly just bug fixes and extensions. In terms of taking that video down, the problem was that video was made, I think back in November at the last conj, when I just had done a quick prototype. And the way Rad is right now is so different from what was in that video. Well, not so different, but, you know, refined, things were renamed. Like, I felt like the demo was probably as helpful as it was misleading. So I didn't want people using that and thinking, oh yeah, this is the way to do it. And so at the moment, the Fulcro Rad demo is the authoritative guide. You know, there is a 30 or 40 page Fulcro Rad book I started, but again, just really short on time. I've tried to keep the book somewhat up to date, but really the demo is it's the authoritative guide. Anytime I add a feature, I add something in that demo that uses the feature. So basically everything that is of significance that is supported in Rad is somewhere in that demo.
That sounds great. And obviously the working code is the best reference. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to have, I used to, when I was teaching, I used to also write. So what I did in the 90s is I taught, I was very fortunate to be right at the cusp of the .com, you know, the internet coming of age, essentially. And I worked with a company that did subcontracting for Sun Microsystems. So I actually taught an HP and NCR. I taught a bunch of Unix and programming and C and C++ and Java, et cetera. And I ended up writing the courses. So that's why there's so much documentation. I got fast at it.
Yeah, it's like gold for anyone trying to learn it. I've never had a better onboarding experience than with Fulcro. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it. I would like to update. I mean, the best practices, this is important, and I just haven't had time to blog about that or anything. The best practices evolve over time. You know, there's nothing incorrect in the developer's guide, but you know, if I were writing it today, I would probably suggest doing things a little differently here and there than what appear to be kind of the primary methods that I you know, push you down. I think I don't stress enough of how you might go about. Well, shoot, I'm having trouble coming up with the exact criticism that I would have without looking at the book. It's just, you know, I do things slightly differently than what's in there. In real production projects. But if you kind of get the gist of what's there and the gist of what Pathome is trying to push, then you kind of do get pushed towards the right direction.
Sounds great. And I think that this kind of group, study group like this, can certainly contribute to documentation as soon as you start to understand the different components of Fulcro. So
yeah.
I'd like to be able to do that if I come across something.
Yeah, I'm telling people these days, you know, starting with the Fulcro Rad demo, even if, you know, you think it's not the thing you want to use, first of all, I think that's a misconception of what Rad is. It is the most up-to-date code. Like if you want to see what I do today when I'm writing Fulcro apps, that's it, right? So that's the better thing for me to say is it isn't that the book's wrong, it's that there's a much easier way to do a lot of the stuff. For just standing up your initial app. And, you know, a lot of the stuff you build for any application involves CRUD screens. And a lot of those CRUD screens, you don't even hand to the end user. Or if you do, you know, you can hand code and prettify them or whatever. But I mean, you know, I sit down and like yesterday, I put together a fairly complex schema with, you know, I don't know, 5 or 6 different entity definitions and multiple attributes and relations, et cetera, in half a day with, you know, full CRUD interfaces. And I wrote absolutely 0 lines of server-side code. I just defined attributes in CLJC. Like, I don't have to write any save functions. I don't have to write any mutations. It really is an accelerator. And then the way I'm constructing the internals of RAD, I mean, the dynamic rendering, which is optional. That's the other thing that people don't necessarily understand about RAD is defsc form and defsc report are just defsc. If you don't give a body, they generate one for you. And they use, kind of higher level attributes to derive the query and ident and initial state for you, but they just emit a defsc. That's all they do. So they're just defsc on steroids. And they come with state machines to manage the full stack IO as well. So if you've got a form, right, they leverage the form state namespace, and there's a database plugin for doing the saves and the loads, et cetera. But at the end of the day, you want to drop to path-ohm resolvers for your reads and path-ohm mutations for your writes on the server. There's nothing that says you can't. And if you want to throw just random peppered in regular defscs around for components, same thing. That's exactly how it's designed. So it's basically just additional features is what it is. So if anybody didn't understand that already.
Great, and it is also quite clear from hanging out in the Slack channel that if you want to go see the current state of the art, then see the Fulcro RAD demo. That was mentioned a number of times from a number of different people, so that was not lost.
Good.
Is there still a link to the video?
The RAD video?
Yeah.
I may have left it on YouTube. I hid it because it's out of date and it's not correct.
Yeah, but just to get a quick overview.
Let me glance and see if I still have that. Like I said, I don't want regular people just dropping into that and thinking that's how you write RAD stuff, but I'm pretty sure I left the video on. Maybe I didn't. No, I don't think I left it up.
Oh, okay.
I should record some new ones. Like I said, when I get some time, I think it would be really useful to show people what that looks like. But yeah, I don't have one right now.
Okay.
The demo, I think, is pretty, the README tells you how to run it. You can spin it right up, and it's basically declarations of attributes and some middleware and some really simple definitions of forms and reports. Well, simple in that they're minimally complex, right? There's some actual inherent complexity in some of the examples I'm doing. There's an invoice example in there that does derived totals and some various other things to just show how you would do them. But in terms of sort of seeing how it works, it's not that hard to play with the demo.
Okay, thanks.
And by the way, I've had this, the one of the startups I'm working on, we've been working on for almost 2 years now. Is that right? I think it might be. Yeah, because we've been kind of working on it part-time until recently. We're approaching goodness, but RAD didn't exist when we started that, and we just tacked it in, like literally in a project that had 20,000-30,000 lines of code already. We just added a dependency and just started using it, and just started slowly pushing. At first, we're using Datomic as a backend, and the Datomic database adapter for it has a schema generation mode if you want to turn that on, but you don't have to. But it also has a schema validation mode where it tries to validate what you've said the attributes should look like and what the database actually looks like. And that's how we actually use it. We still manually do our database schema the way we were doing it when we started the project, because that's just, the project was already set up that way, and we just turn on the validations. And so when we go to add schema, we add the attributes, and if we mismatch them, it won't start. It tells us, hey, you didn't match those up right. And so, it kind of makes it's intended to be that way. It's intended to be something you can kind of shoehorn into an existing project and just start using at whatever level fits for you.
Specifically on RAD, I have two quick questions actually. One is you're using a mutant as the server. Is that still the
Arbitrary.
okay?
Yeah. I think I switched from HTTP to a mutant just because it had a higher performance,
Oh, right. No, the reason I was asking is because I think mutant isn't currently maintained. That's why I was just wondering whether.
Oh, yeah, I didn't realize that. I can't keep up with all the libraries.
Yeah, there was a huge.
Yeah, it's just Ring middleware. It just doesn't matter what server you use.
Okay, that's fine then. In that case, and the other thing I wanted to ask is it compatible with Atomic Cloud, or is that a?
Of course. So there's two answers to that question. One is someone put in a PR to add Datomic Cloud support. I don't think it's merged yet. In fact, I think I've closed the PR because the additional work I requested that he do to clean it up never materialized. Right. So I don't use Datomic Cloud myself. I'm not going to put cycles on it myself. Yeah. As far as the database adapter working with Datomic Cloud, it's a fairly simple thing. And if you go look at the closed PRs, you'll see most of the work, like somebody's got it working, and I guess Jarrett's saying he uses it with cloud. Mm-hmm. Did we merge that, Jarrett? Hello, Jarrett. I think you're muted.
Yeah, you might be muted.
Mic problems. So I don't remember the state of that. So here's the thing though, it'll work with any database. The database adapter does three potential things. Introspection of your schema to see that your attribute declarations are correct. You can turn that on or off, or a database adapter can choose not to provide it. It's a convenience feature. Schema generation. Well, schema generation is always rife with potential problems because the way you want to model it may not be the way the author of the library that does the schema generation wants to model it, right? So that's kind of a crapshoot that I consider a feature that's nice for rapid application initial development, but very often you'll just take over the schema yourself. And then well, really four things. The third thing is translation of the form state diffs from Fulcro front end to the back end. That's a standard format. It's been defined in the form state namespace for years. I don't know when I wrote that, 2016 or something, right? It's a minimal diff format, normalized, keyed by ident with maps of before and after values. Well, keyed by ident, subkeyed by field name, and then each field name has a map that says before and after value. And the form state automatically calculates which fields change and just sends you a minimal diff. So the database adapter for save just has to translate those minimal diffs to real writes. That's actually a fairly straightforward task. The Datomic version of that's under, I think, 200 lines of code. And then you can also provide for convenience read generation. So generation of path-home resolvers that will read the attributes out of the database given the declarations of the attributes. The Datomic adapter includes all four of those. The Postgres adapter includes all four of those, although it's way more alpha. I don't use it personally, and nobody else I think is. If somebody else is using it, I would love to hear it. And if somebody else is interested in maintaining it, I'd love to accept a maintainer. It would be trivial to make a Redis adapter, right? And make a document store out of Redis. Firebase, et cetera, et cetera. Literally, these adapters should be 400 or 500 lines of code, but you don't need one. So that's the other thing, is you can write your own mutation for saving and name it the right thing, and write your own resolvers for the reads, and just write your own network API. So that's all the database adapters technically really doing, is writing a network API that can issue the reads or respond to the reads, and can respond to two mutations: save form and delete entity, I think, are the two primary mutations. That's it. So you want to use it with any database. It really isn't that much code to adapt it.
Okay, interesting. I personally tend to use Postgres quite a bit. So
yeah, I love Postgres. It's a great product.
Yes, if I do end up using RAD in a project, then I might get back in contact with you with regards to potentially taking a look at it and sorting out the maintenance side if we end up going with it more significantly. So yeah. Okay. Anyone else? But thanks for that. By the way, that was a pretty comprehensive answer. Anyone else, by the way, who has a question? If not, I can have follow-ons. Okay. So one thing I've been wondering actually is it seems that RAD is really well set up to do kind of stuff that's directly derivable from data. But for projects that need a bit more dynamic stuff, so higher order components and things like this, I've found it quite difficult to put those together. And I don't know whether that's just because I'm doing it wrong or because that wasn't really something that you were planning on supporting. So just
explain what you mean. Give me an example.
So for example, I've and quite a lot of questions I've had in the past have been around this sort of stuff. So I have been trying to build components that can be used by other components and potentially sort of building up sort of several components. So for example, say I have a tree structure and a structure that both in the same subcomponent, and then kind of and then these are sort of potentially passed around and used as an argument. So when the component stuff loads, I mean, in my experience, these are just functions, so they all just kind of compose nicely. But for whatever reason, I've had difficulties kind of getting the data to be either available or loading incorrectly or have caching issues. I'm just wondering whether that's just something outside the scope of the design, or I'm definitely doing it wrong, or something else.
Yeah. So, and this is another aspect of core Fulcro. So the initial design of Fulcro was really targeted at, as you're discovering, applications that had kind of a static layout, right? Your typical business application, you know exactly what you're putting where, what it's called, et cetera. And when you start talking about higher order component kinds of things, you typically are, for most developers, you're talking about libraries of things that do things for you, like React Navigator or something, right? Yeah. Something that you provide, here's the 4 components for my 4 screens, and then you figure out how to show each one. So as you're discovering in Fulcro, because the core design is that you compose the query and the state to root, so that the tree of the UI matches the tree of your reified database. The graph in your database has a subgraph that is a tree that exactly matches your UI, right? And so you get this one-to-one correspondence between that's what I'm rendering and there's the rendering of it. That has a lot of advantages, but it also has this very specific disadvantage and hang up, and that's that if you want to use a component that has queries as this kind of free-floating magical, it's not really magical, right? And in the plain React sense, it's I just want a function, right? I want to say use state in it, and I just want to use it somewhere and just be done. And so the trade-off you've got there is when you use state, et cetera, you're embedding some like mutable mess right there at that kind of that mount point of that thing. So it gives you the dynamism. But then even if you're using something like Apollo has adopted the normalized state mechanisms, and they've really done it at a component level, right? They've said you say what the component ID is, and you kind of say, right, we can kind of sub-build your query, but then we're going to have you embed the caching mechanism right there with it, so you can like drop these in where you want it, and then right there's some magic that happens. You can do that exact same pattern with Fulcro. So what you're looking for is floating roots. That's one way of doing it. So essentially the query engine in Fulcro is written to be fast, right? First, that is number one criteria above everything else, way above everything else, is when I run a query for the UI, that query needs to run quickly. And in fact, in the Fulcro 3 rewrite, I think I get somewhere between a 3 times and a 10-fold increase in performance on just that layer of Fulcro's internal performance because I consider it so important. And as a result, as you've seen, the query language that's supported at the component layer is what some people would consider rather light, right? You can't tell it to order things. You can't tell it to group things, right? It's not an advanced query engine. It really is just a very simple graph query language. And that's by design. That's very intentional. All of those things that you might want to do in Clojure are so trivial to do at the rendering layer that why not take the hit right there where it makes sense to take the hit, right? Don't add complexity into the query engine that slows every query down because you might want to do something in one of your components. Now, you've got two choices of pulling data from the database, right? You've got using a join based on a prop where the prop has to be in the context that that component is mounted into, right? If it's mounted into root, then those keywords are relative to the root of the database. If it's mounted from some parent, then those keywords are relative to the context of the data that was found for that parent, right? It's always a relative graph once you're out of a root. So the multi-root extension of Fulcro, and I believe I've made the multi-root renderer the default now. If I haven't, you might have to set it, but it's in the book. Basically allows you to make a component that says I'm a root. When my parent mounts me, I just become this free-floating magical thing. And so you can use that for this exact sort of thing, this dynamism, where you could then hand that thing to an arbitrary component that could then just use it and mount it and not worry about where it gets its data. Now, initial state is still potentially a concern, and I actually haven't, I don't think I put this in the book, but there is, here, actually it'd be easier just to give you a link. In the Fulcro repository, I was just showing this to Jarrett the other day, in fact. Wrong. I think it's in the multi-root. Yeah, this right here. It's, we have chat and Zoom, don't we? So this is an example of using hooks with a use Fulcro mount to do the same sort of floating root sort of thing. Where here I'm also generating an ID that I'm garbage collecting out of the database when this thing mounts and unmounts. So if you go and play with this, this is in workspaces on Fulcro itself. So just check out the repository and follow the directions to run workspaces. You can try this out. The main root has a button to toggle the children on and off, right? It's just got a win show. So you hit toggle and it either shows the children or it doesn't. And if you watch the state database, you'll see some arbitrary UUID appear for other child. Another child has a other ID. So you'll see an other ID, some UUID, and data for this thing. Here's the initial state of the thing appear when it mounts, and this will clean it up. It'll disappear when it unmounts. And this UGC helper in the hooks, this set is the list of keywords that it can follow recursively to do cascading deletes. So this pattern, if you want to use hooks and then end up with a function-based component for React, would be, this is kind of the, one way of doing it.
Right.
And then of course, if you want to throw your, some sort of effect handler in here as a hook to do loads or whatever else, you can do that as well.
Okay, great. Because I mean, that was one of the other things I was curious about, because every time I try and create sort of UI components that load in.
I'm sorry. I just walked through a bunch of code and you couldn't see that, could you?
No. If you're okay with sort of showing that again.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I was wondering whether you were just describing it and then we were like supposed to follow along.
Tell me if I'm not. Yeah, tell me if I'm not sharing my screen when I do something like that. I was doing that in the browser. Yeah. So down here in the root, there's this button, this toggle button. So can you see my screen now?
Yep, definitely.
Okay, great. And that'll mount the direct children. And then one of these children, or is it both children? Yeah, each of the children renders an alternate root, which is a hooks-based component. And I've got this hook, this effectful hook that generates a UUID. And for the duration of that mount, that UUID will be a constant. And then this use Fulcro mount is an effect hook that will put the initial state that you give it into the app state. And here's, right, so I'm normalizing a new child at that ID into the app state. And then other child it looks just like a normal component, right? It thinks it has a relative query from, in this case, itself, because this use Fulcro mount generates a root for it. And then this use GC effect, you tell it the ident of the thing you'd like to clean up. And then when this thing unmounts and the cleanup side of the use GC happens, it will wipe that out from the database and then follow these edges recursively to clean up state if you want.
Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, so that basically allows you to kind of essentially compose in different chunks of UI and have them essentially using the same app DB and then cleaning up afterwards. Perfect.
Yeah. The GC is kind of an optional thing. It's just it's often the thing you want to do, right? I'm going to throw a drop down on the screen. Oh, what's its ID? Pfft, I don't care. It's a drop down. Just put it in the database. So you see right here on line 53, I'm not passing any props to that. This guy is not a data child of this child component. It's just a UI child. And if you go look at the implementation of this use Fulcro mount, it's really pretty straightforward. It really just does DB to tree against the database starting at the right ident and renders the thing.
Right. I'm assuming that's optional though, as in like you could pass it props if you wanted to.
So if you pass props here, they come in, realize that this child might not render when this thing needs to render. So that's why you have to, you actually have to set, and I must have changed the default renderer to a multi-root renderer because I'm not setting the optimized render here. So you actually have to have the multi-root render installed. And basically what this floating root stuff does is it registers this as it mounts as a new additional root. So when a render gets scheduled, it renders the primary root and then it walks through every other registered root and tries to update it.
Okay.
And then of course from there, should component update, all Fulcro components by default are pure, do their props compare to decide if they've changed. So when I render from the real root, this child will render, of course, it's mounting. It'll render all of its stuff, and it'll render this, which will register the new root. And then actually the new root code in here will actually pull the props for this guy and feed it to them, right? Because you didn't pass props through here. If you do pass props through here, they show up in computed.
Okay, fine. So it is available. It's just inside the computer.
Right, and you have to assume that the computed props won't change unless this child props change, right? And it re-renders. And I don't remember if you get the updated computed or not, because technically this won't remount, right? When this guy re-renders, it's not remounting this thing. So it could be that the computed props are constant for the duration of your mount.
Okay, fine.
I just don't remember.
That's interesting.
So yeah, so these are, and if you look at the code for these, you'll see it's not a lot of code to make this sort of pattern. And it really is. It does always boil down to, I tell people over and over again on the channel, it boils down to query ident initial state. Like you got to get the state in there. You got to have the query right. It has to all match. If you get those three things right, there really isn't much else to it. There's a lot of minutia in the different namespaces for doing more, higher level things. But at the core of it, that's really it. So when you go and look at these internally, it's like 4 or 5 lines of code. It's like get the query, run db to tree on the state, send the props to the component.
Right. Okay. I don't want to hog all the questions. So if anyone else has one, please jump in. Otherwise, I do have others that I can ask.
I think I have kind of a follow-up to this one. And for our projects right now, I have to create basically modal dialog windows. And I've been wondering a bit what's the best approach to do those. One option is, of course, to use a floating root. What I've done right now, just for the first version, is to use the local state. But of course, then I cannot use the form state functionality.
Right.
And in a thread, someone recommended using computed props, though I haven't tried that one yet. I don't know if that would work. What would be your approach?
So I do modals in usually one of two ways. If it's a generalized modal, then I'll just put it in the root as a component, put its state in a well-known location, and just write mutations to update what the modal says and show and hide it, right? So there'll be one modal that a bunch of different pieces of the code all use, right? Because the modal, only one is going to be showing at a given time. And you could certainly do that same sort of approach for any number of them. Before there were React portals and hooks, that was by far the easiest thing to do, because you wanted them to be in the root for the compliance, accessibility compliance kind of reasons, and just having them right there off the root made it easy to go and find them and add more and put wins around them or whatever and say, yeah, I've got 6 modals and here's how you make one show up and here's how you make it go away. And so I've done that before. And the other approach is what you just said. Just using this approach I just showed you is what I will typically do more recently. And I typically will use, I currently use Semantic UI React for all of my UI in my projects, which is why there's a Semantic UI adapter for Rad. And its modal already creates a portal that puts it on root, that puts it in the root of the, the body of the document. It uses a React portal to do that. So I don't have to worry about where I embed it in my app. I can just stick it anywhere. So in that sense, composing the modal in right where I need it. Like if it is a specialized modal that goes with just one section of the app, I just compose it right there. And just have a UI, modal show kind of flag to turn it on and off. Yeah. So I don't do anything this complicated. I literally compose it in with, its query, its initial state, its ident. I just compose it from the root into the application.
I think my problem there was to have it, like the component that calls the modal, of course, has to put some initial info into it, but the modal should also be able to update its own props with set value and stuff. And when I just directly embed it, I'm going to have all this modification stuff in the parent, basically.
Right, so but remember that the mutations are working on a normalized database. So if you pre-compose at application start, the modal is not in anybody's mind yet, but at application start, your initial state composes through the tree all the way through to the modal, and you give the modal some initial stuff, including that it's not showing, right? Then it's already composed in and normalized, and it exists at some place in your database, component by ID modal 3, right? And you just write some mutations that know how to show, hide that, and modify the content of it, right? The message, the title, what have you. It's now a normalized thing with a fixed set of mutations. And yeah, then those can be used from wherever. Now, of course, it doesn't make sense to ask to show it if the thing that it's embedded within isn't on the screen, which is why I said sometimes you just embed these at the root of the application if there's something that can be used in a general purpose way, right? If any screen in your program can show the modal, then obviously the modal needs to compose to root. But if the modal has only to do with one particular screen, then it needs to be embedded there. And it doesn't matter if a parent's going to call the mutations to show and hide it. It's still composed in and ready to render. So I would, I typically will try to put things like that just in. They're in the database the second the application starts. I don't try to do any sort of magic of putting them in and taking them out and cleaning things up. And you've got gigabytes in a browser tab. Sweating that sort of stuff just creates headaches.
Yeah, but they're like the specific problem I had there was when I give it the initial state is like for example, we have one model that is for introducing two people to each other.
Mhm.
And when it opens, it should have one of the people set already, and the rest should be editable. So when I give it this, basically I then give it a partial props map.
Sure.
And the rest I can use m/set state set value or whatever, and I can see it in the inspector that it gets updated in the normalized database. But eventually, when I send it to the server, it will only send like this initial partial props from the parent. So I'm not sure if that's the place where computed props would.
I think computer props probably isn't your problem there. It's probably how you've initialized the form support. So you're saying you're using form support? The form state?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're using form state, make sure you understand that when it calculates a diff, it's a minimal diff. And it's only based on the things that are declared as form fields. So
But I also tried like sending over the props map from the FSC instead of using form state, and this would also be only partial in that case.
If the props are partial in your query, either your query is wrong or that it's not really in the database, right? I mean, it's just I was a bit confused because it actually does show up in the Fulcro inspector for some reason. But probably maybe Fulcro at this part isn't aware of it, so. Yeah, I mean, all I can say is it's got to be related to your query or your ident.
Okay.
And some potentially misunderstanding of form state is also possible. But if you're saying the stuff's not in props, well, if it's not in props, then it's either not in your query or it's not in the state.
Yeah.
Now, when someone mentions computed to you, let me clarify what computed is, because I think a lot of people misunderstand computed as well. Computed has to do primarily with re-rendering non-locally. And so it really depends upon which renderer you're using as to whether or not computed really even matters. So the idea is, up here in like this example I've got on screen, let's say I was using the ident optimized render, and this child, I noticed that this child's props changed. I could render this child in isolation just by running the query on the database based on the known ident of the mounted component. So child ID 3, say for example, I noticed that changes in the database. I can go to the on-screen component that is currently rendering child 3, pull its props via its query, and resend them to it. But if I do that, I call that props tunneling. If I tunnel the props to this child, I've just skipped anything that the parent might have mixed into props. And so child could actually potentially update with stuff missing in props, right? If the stuff was sent from up here. So if I had a render UI child and I said merge, the child data that I get here with some extra stuff, it'll work on the first render because the first render happens from root, and the stuff the parent mixed into the props will end up in props here.
Yeah.
But on an update, if you're using a renderer that can do tunneled props, and tunneled props also happen when you use any of the new double bang, set value double bang, set string double bang, those immediately tunnel the props to the component. They don't render through the parent. So the way computed works is you're telling Fulcro, these are the props that came from the database, and this is stuff I mixed in. And so the props tunneling system remembers the stuff you told it to mix in, so that if it renders the child in isolation as an optimization, it will remix in the stuff that the parent originally or most recently passed it. That's all computed is about. It's about trying to make your targeted UI optimization updates work properly in the context of the parent wants to pass you some stuff that it made up. So you don't need, for example, to use computed if the component doesn't have a query. So if the component doesn't have a query, there's no way for Fulcro to update it right outside of that.
There's no data for Fulcro.
Exactly. There's nothing for Fulcro to do. It will never try to render that child in isolation. It will always be sending the props in. So that's what Compute is about. Compute is about rendering optimization. Ultimately, it's about Fulcro being able to look the components up in the index and say, I just want to refresh just that one on the screen. But I need to know what the parent was sending.
Yeah.
So if you're doing that, if you're merging in data to props, that would break things.
Yeah. But it sounds like it's something I should at least try out for my models then.
Well, like I said, computed is only needed if that's the specific thing you're doing. If you're merging extra stuff into props that didn't come straight out of your database, then if you're not using computed, you're doing it wrong. But if that's not what you're doing, computed has nothing to do with it.
Okay, but then that's what I need.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks.
Sorry, just to clarify then. So computed is specifically for the case when you're merging in extra stuff outside the database.
Correct. Like a callback. I want to send a callback down to a child and the child has a query, right? The callback won't, if you put the callback in props, it'll be there the first time it renders. But if Fulcro does a render of that child in isolation, it won't know what lambda you passed unless you've marked it as computed from the parent.
Right. Okay.
So that's really all it's for. And if you use a keyframe render and no floating roots, you don't need computed. But if you don't use it and you switch renderers, then a lot of stuff will break.
Okay. So wait. So that okay. So I think is it keyframe 2 or keyframe 1 you're talking about there?
Keyframe is what I'm talking about. Keyframe 2 does allow for targeted updates as an optimization. So plain keyframe, there is no targeted updates. It's always render from root. And so if you use plain keyframe render, you'll have an easier time because there's a little bit less to think about, and it will be much more consistent in terms of refresh because you won't have to consider some of the optimization trade-offs in terms of what might end up being stale on the screen due to how you write code, or stale in state, right? Callbacks not being passed right. But it'll always be render from root. So then if you decide, oh, this is going too slow, I want to switch to this other renderer, and you've not followed the patterns, well, then suddenly code will break.
Yep. Thank you. Anyone else have a question? Otherwise, yes, no. So one thing I've been wondering is, when you're doing development, are you basically just doing something REPL driven, or is it like, how do you? So okay, let me reframe the question. When I'm doing development in Fulcro, one of the things that I have difficulty with is it's hard always to keep track of exactly what is kind of being stored, modified, and so on. And so I'm wondering what kind of things you do on your development cycle to kind of make this process clearer for you.
It's been stored and modified. Could you clarify that part of the question?
So I've had situations where I am loading data in, and then I will sort of see values falling into the AppDB, and then not necessarily know exactly how to pull them out, or what I would expect to be the key that I would pull them out with as a query doesn't return anything. I've had situations where I've tried to merge in data and that's gone into the wrong place. I've had situations where I've tried to do things like targeted merges or replaces or appends, and once again, it's not quite gone to the right place. And normally when I'm working in a development environment in Clojure, I sort of tinker with stuff at the REPL, right? And I've not yet worked out a way of doing that here. A lot of it is write some code in the editor, reload the page, and then hope that that works this time. I'm wondering whether you have a more elegant approach than that, which is quite a slow cycle.
Yeah, so I got two parts to that answer. One, one is, yes, you can definitely do REPL-driven stuff that will accelerate that. I typically personally don't, because I understand the algorithms really well. So, data doesn't show up in the wrong place for me. Like there's, it's like, that's where I want it. That's where it goes. Typically when you use merge component or data targeting or something, and it doesn't go the way you expect, it's either because you don't understand the API and don't realize what the specific parameters actually mean. That could be one potential problem. If you do actually understand all of that and a surprise happens, it's always query ident or the server responded with the wrong shape. That's it. So I spend a lot of time in Fulcro Inspect just looking at the tabs. So here, I don't have anything running at the moment. I'll go ahead and start up. I should have done this earlier so I'd have something going. So you can, if you've put the app in an Atom, you can run most any of the functions that have to do with merging things or loading things based on that app. You don't have to put it in an Atom. I take that back. It used to be you had to put it in an Atom. Nowadays, don't bother. All of the stuff that can change in the app is in there in Atoms. So the app is can just be a constant. It can just be a def once value. So there are a couple of things that I'll typically do. One, I'll very often on the divs, if I'm working in a application that has a fairly complex data model, is I'll be sure to include like a data -id attribute on some div that drops the ID of the thing in there so that I can easily go and find it in the database. You know, just by right clicking and inspecting and just looking at the database on the DOM element, and go, that's the one I want. We did have, and unfortunately I haven't had time to add it back for Fulcro 3. There for a while we had a, did I start that already? Yes. How do I get rid of this mess? Right. So in terms of has everybody played with the DB Explorer yet?
I personally have a bit, but one of the things that's very confusing for me is that search doesn't quite find what I expect. I've typed in keys and idents and then had them either not appearing even though I can see them inside the DB itself. Something like that has occurred.
So there's a control out here for by value or by ID. So if you use the by ID, and I don't know what I've got out here, like account like 101, right? That's going to find, if the by ID is selected, it'll look for idents. It'll look in the tables for things that have that in their ID portion of the of that guy, and then idents are clickable, so you can navigate, you can go back, that sort of thing. So if you're trying to debug a particular query, you can always start from some specific spot. I know this particular thing that's mounted is some particular, report, and it's the real sales report, and I'm interested in, right? You can just kind of walk down and say, oh, I'm joining on this key or I'm joining on that key, follow the ident, and see that the database actually matches up. In terms of REPL stuff, yes, I often do have I think I'd call it main in this one. I don't remember, guessing the app is on, nope. Where did I put the app in this one? Oh, yeah, it is in this namespace. And actually, I'm going to go out of the comment block for that to make sure I've just got it required. But you can definitely come down here and just do a, load and then some well-known, key or ident or, whatever. And then your options, and, target it, give it parameters, what have you, and you can just run this straight in the REPL. Right. Those of you, well, I'm pretty sure most of you are using shadow, tap is really a handy thing that Thomas has added here recently. This is just a built-in in Shadow CLJS, and it's what this inspect tab is for. Oh, shoot. Yeah, how do I get this thing out of my way? Oh, did I not put that in it?
I think
Oh,
you
yeah,
are
I can't do that. Yep. Oh, why is it whining about that?
Yeah, if you're in a comment form, then it actually does validation. So map keys must have values, and UUIDs must be conforming to UIDs.
Yeah. I knew the reader had to be able to read it, but I didn't realize ... wouldn't, because that's just a symbol. Like,
yes, but if you had, I think, two symbols, it would work, just not one.
oh, I had a map there.
Yeah.
All right. And of course, oh, I'm sorry, I haven't upgraded Shadow in this. This works in the latest Shadow. Evidently, I'm using an older, on this particular project, I think it's still an older Shadow. Yeah, 210 something or another. Anyway, this gives you a way to click through and explore data that isn't necessarily in the app database. So I use this in debugging Fulcro itself, because the app has things like the network queues and the the runtime atom that has various other internal state things that have nothing to do with the application database. They're more like Fulcro's state, and some of it's rather large. And so this doesn't try to recursively print the entire thing. So you can kind of just like, it's more like Rebel.
Right.
So if you haven't used that yet, upgrade your Shadow and give it a shot. It's actually pretty handy. But that's sort of the short of it. If I'm trying to debug, like, if I were trying to learn how to use merge component, for example, you can definitely, drop into the application, go to the database or DB Explorer, do one of these merges and see stuff show up.
Right.
So for example, let me see. Do I have the account? I don't know where I put it. And then so like this guy, for example, I can actually do that, and now I should find an account 23 that's got that data.
Right.
And if I wanted to play with the the merge component has named parameters, so I could say so now I should have a top key that points at account 23. Right. So I can kind of explore targeting there as well. So if I wanted to put that edge, right? Because really this is an edge of your graph right there. That's all targeting is doing, is targeting is here, place this edge at some place. That some place is either going to be a target 1 long or 3 long, right? You're typically either going to put it in a table or you're going to put it at the top.
Yeah.
So, so any one of these, if I wanted to throw the edge inside of this guy, I could just follow those down. So yeah, I'm sure this has probably answered your question at this point.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's definitely there's definitely some the thing I most like about it is the documentation is very detailed, but there's an element of trying to work out as a beginner how to navigate it, which I think is like really helpful running these kinds of things, which is why we did the Q&A group as well.
Yeah.
So anyone else have any other follow-ups or new questions?
Yeah, this sort of REPL kind of thing is particularly handy for starting to understand the APIs. And when you run some network thing, which, I could, you can see these in here and send that to the query tab. And then if you wanted to, you could pull this out and run it through data fetch load.
Right.
At your REPL, that sort of thing. Or you can just run it here and see the results come back. But yeah, that's most of the time. I would say early on, back when the project was called Untangled, we didn't have inspect, and it was a lot of dumping the state atom. It was a lot making the utilities that would show you what was in state. And like you said, when you're first trying to assemble stuff, the state atom gets rather large, and you're like, well, I just stuck something in there. I don't want to have to look through all of that and try to figure it out. And this tab was written very early on, and it's part of the reason DB Explorer exists is this search is horrifically slow because it's trying to render everything in the database. So for an application of any size, this search is useless. And rather than take the time to rewrite all of this was much faster to just write. And then with this by value by ID search, if you just loaded something, you can glance in the network tab and see, oh, I got that as a response, right? You could go searching for some piece of this data in the database explorer and see, oh, why did that end up there? Or, okay, that's going to have an ident of such. Where is that ident? That sort of thing. And that's more where the by value comes in handy. So if I look for the 100, this is not only going to give me the table entry itself, this is going to show me all the places where it's used as a value. So if I were trying to see, like, okay, I targeted it, where did it merge in? Well, I would expect its ident to show up wherever, right? It's a normalized database. So yeah, that's typically, it's the same thing over and over again. Once you get used to the fact that it's normalized, it gets a lot easier. Because instead of just like glazing over as you look at this big blob of stuff, you're always in some context, right? I know this is some account. And with the HTML5 routing here, I can even see, oh, that's account 100, that sort of thing, and just go look for it in the database. But what I was saying earlier, where, if I'm writing production code and it's a complicated data model, I'll just actually make one of these things, put the data ID and drop that on the div, so then I know where to go look for it in the database.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that it's a lot better now, but one of the things that I had a lot of difficulty with in the early days was uncertainty around sort of how to take a thing which was rendering here and place it somewhere else, and so therefore the kind of edge manipulation and moving things around, or even just having data appear in two different ways in two different places, the same data source, where you're modifying it in one place and you want those changes to propagate correctly. That sort of stuff was all quite kind of involved and took a bunch of time to understand how to do.
But then you realized it boiled down to idents.
Right? Yeah, I mean that certainly helped. Absolutely. Or just knowing that actually what I should be doing is storing my data in one place and then making sure that everything else is just an edge to that location.
Exactly. It's a normalized database.
Yeah.
So that really is all there is to it.
And that, I think, helped a lot, was kind of, because normally when you're used to working with stuff, your expectation is that you sort of, you have your data in, say, a single location, but then that location might be a component.
Exactly.
That are referencing.
Right. They're tied together.
Whereas this is, have an independent place, which is the kind of unique name for that thing in your app DB, and then have actual ident edges going to that place wherever they are. Right.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, that's the biggest transition. Once you get that, then like I said, the floating root thing, or using that, what we talked about earlier with the use mount or a floating root, where you can disconnect something from the reified graph. You don't have to follow an edge to get to it.
Yeah.
Those are the two ways of doing it. Either you have to follow, if you're doing traditional stuff, you have to follow an edge to get to it, or you have to use component local state. Those are your two choices. And with the floating roots, well, okay, you can choose not to follow an edge as you're crossing that, DOM boundary in the tree, and then you pick up following edges again.
Yeah.
And once you get that, yeah, sometimes you do have to walk back a few components to find the thing in the database that you know is there, and then follow the edges manually through the database, which the DB Explorer really helps you with, right? I'm in some account, and it has, I don't have any, who am I in? Sam? I don't know which one Sam is. Could be the last one I check, right? So primary address is that one, and then addresses, right? Am I in Sam? Oh, that's Tony. All right. I was like, why isn't that changing? Here we go, Sam. All right. So addresses is, right, two different idents, and right. So I might have to follow down the graph there. Oops. To find the particular thing, but I can use this DB Explorer to walk the graph as I'm also looking at my code. And of course, in RAD, there's fewer things to actually look at, probably more the model, but you can kind of follow them in parallel. And you can also see, like, the form state config is normalized by this very strange looking ident with a keyword, and then this map is its ID.
Right. Thanks. Actually, yeah, that's very helpful. Anyone else have any kind of, as I said, follow-on questions or new questions?
I was wondering, what's your strategy for testing your components?
So, typically, I do not do much in the way of UI layer testing, because the components are, I don't embed very much logic there. If there's much logic at all, I write that as standalone functions and test those functions. Like if I, for example, had logic to paginate something, right? I might write the functions that have to do with pagination, test those functions, and then just use them in the UI. Doing something from this layer, I do a little bit of Cypress smoke testing, where it's the full app is running and it clicks on the user interface and it tries to type things in or click on things. But for my purposes, those kinds of tests I find to be, from an accounting perspective, just bad business. They're very expensive. They break very easily. They break for bad reasons. They're hard to understand when they break. They don't really tell you what's wrong in your logic. They just tell you something's wrong. And so that's why I use them for smoke tests, right? It is sometimes useful to know, well, is the app up? Does this general screen seem to load correctly, right? Where, if I load that screen and it comes up right, it means the database is working and this is working and that is working. Like, those are really useful tests to have. But in terms of just testing an individual component, I won't typically try to automate that kind of testing, very rarely.
Okay.
I know that Wilker in Workspaces, when he was at Nubank, what he would do, Workspaces is extensible. You can add your own controls to the card, the spaces. And he had it set up where they had specs for all of their props and generators for all of those props. And so he could embed a component in a card and tell it that it was in generative mode, and it would generate data that followed the specs of the props and pass it to the component. And then you could just say refresh, and it would keep sending like randomized data to it. And you could just tinker with it and see, does it render right? Does it crash for any reason? Like, he did sort of a generative testing around it that was somewhat manual, right? But you could sort of like play with it in workspaces very quickly and see whether or not you'd miss something like, all right, it's going to throw a null pointer exception right here because I forgot to guard against the fact that that prop can be null, that sort of thing. And I can see some utility in that, but the vast majority of the bugs that I find in my programs have nothing to do with the UI component. Usually a UI bug is something like the CSS looks a little funky, you know, it's not typically a logic error.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Anyone else? No. Just trying to think of if there's anything else that anyone's asked me as well to bring up.
Actually, I have a follow-up question for Tony on that specific topic that we were talking about with regards to idents and queries. Having some examples of various different levels of complexity of this concept of, okay, if you have a component, what should the query and ident be for the simplest case? What's the next level up from that? Let's say you have a component that derives its, or it gets its props from a parent component. What would the query and ident be for that? Okay, let's get a higher level example. Are there any, is any place in the documentation that describes that kind of progression from simplest case understanding queries, idents, and then progressing through levels of complexity in a kind of a stepwise process?
I can't think of anything in the docs that's specific on a stepwise process. I mean, I've got a live template that I use in IntelliJ, and this kind of sort of, you can sort of immediately see, my live template on the first thing I type, it thinks is going to be the ID of the thing. So it goes ahead and generates the ident for me and throws it in the query. And I go to the next thing. I mean, this is what it almost always is. There really isn't much of a progression for your standard component that has a varying identity, right? So something like account or person or car or whatever, right? Something that's going to be in your database is going to look like this always.
Right.
Almost without exception. And if it's something that's loaded, it probably is not going to have initial state. Now, the next kind of component, though, is a component that is a singleton, right? It's some component that lives in one place in the database, and probably doesn't have, well, it definitely doesn't have an ID that changes over time, although it might have whatever this namespace is. It might have some initial state for some props, right? So that's really the second basic pattern that you'll find.
Right, and that makes sense from looking at the code. You can see a couple of the singletons there that initially had me confused, but this makes a lot of sense. Tony, would you be willing to share your IntelliJ code template?
Oh, certainly.
That would be great.
I think I've even got that sitting on my desktop because people ask me for that pretty regularly.
Great.
Yeah, I think it's in this zip file. Is that something I can share in here,
or? I think.
If this has
it does have file sharing. I don't know whether we can kind of do something with that afterwards. The other thing,
yeah, just ping me on the Fulcro thread that we're on after the meeting or whatever, remind me, and I'll just plop it on Slack.
Great, thank you.
Or maybe I'll stick it on GitHub or something. I don't know. But yeah, easy enough to do, and I think that's really the only only code template that I've written, but yeah, that's just almost always what you do, right? You give it a name, and then you give it some ID, and then there's some other stuff. And then you end up typing those other two things out that you kind of already know what they are. So
I think I'll write a blog post on this and send it to the group for make sure it's correct. And then I think this could be a good initial kind of primer for non-Fulcro people to understand the basics.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're really just defining this is where the thing goes, and this is what it initially has, and then there's no magic around this. And this is a common misunderstanding as well. This has to be composed to root, right? So I've got some, the sum component. Oops. And this is a shorthand, actually. And notice I've not put these in my application or anything. I just threw these out here. Oops. Oh, I have a compiler. Oh, that should not have that. Why is that? Oh, I just doubled up on my roots there. So this isn't in an application or anything. When I query for a root, like the value of that query is literally that composition, right? It's literally call that function and get its query and throw it here in this map and throw that there in that vector. And the same thing for get initial state, which I have to pass parameters. That's walking the same thing. It's saying, well, what's root's initial state? Well, it's the initial state. It's this map that's got this key. And technically, this is a function that takes parameters. The macro does a little bit of magic for you here. Oops. Right. So that's technically what the macro is outputting here is it's outputting a lambda that actually takes parameters, which I'm ignoring. Same result. The shorthand is if you supply a map, it's magic. And so if it sees in the query that you've joined to a component, it treats the value here as a parameter map to get initial state. And you can actually do too manys here. You can actually do right, and I'll get some component with a vector of those in there. So back to your question of REPL-driven stuff. Yeah, definitely can do REPL-driven stuff.
Yeah.
So that initial state, right, that composes all the way to root. And so I get a tree out of that, right? If I go and put another child here, I'll get a further tree, et cetera. But I also have the idents. And so the combination of those idents and the query let me normalize that as the initial database. And that's really all it is. Initial state is literally you could construct this tree by hand right here in that lambda. You don't have to use function calls. You could just make the lambda, paste in this this whole tree manually. In fact, that's what OmNext had you do. That's really where this kind of, right, the whole system design originated, was there, and that's what you used to have to do in OmNext, is you had to manually construct this tree of crap. But that is a maintenance nightmare. So initial state is just, well, you're already composing the query. Why not compose the initial state?
Actually, I have a question on the design side based on that. So it seems like you made a deliberate design decision to separate sort of this sort of static state from things like data fetch load. And data fetch load. So one of the things that puzzled me a lot when I was working initially is that things like data fetches have to be done in sort of not obvious places. Like you either have to do them specifically, and I have this huge stack of data fetches, which is on the kind of app itself when I'm loading it, or it happens at login, and it happens. So it's really hard sometimes to keep track of where data fetches are happening, and what I would have expected to happen, considering that all the queries are co-located, is things like fetches are also going to be somewhat co-located with the components of what's going to happen, and then that will be propagated out.
Well, but so, why would you expect that?
I suppose it's when I'm sort of creating a new component, which is based on some existing code that I wrote, and modifying it, I then have to kind of remind myself, oh, wait, what are the data fetches that are actually associated with this? And then start kind of, it's from an organizational perspective, it's sometimes not obvious as to where I need to go. And, you know, you spend sort of a bit of time here and there kind of thinking, oh, this is broken. What did I do wrong? And then realizing that it's missing data because some fetch hasn't been triggered correctly.
Right. So think of this, and I've said this before in the channel, I think of Fulcro, and I love the fact that it has this property. I think of it as, you know, kind of a classic keyframe animation system, right? Like if you've ever taken the tour at Disney Studios, you know, you go see the old classic cells, you know, with the hand-drawn pictures on them, you know, it's just like, here's what this frame looks like, and then here's what this frame looks like, right? The UI is, or the whole application is essentially that. You're trying to give the impression to the user that this is what should be on the screen now. And of course, you're also side effecting to some store system typically to maintain some idea of what that state is for, you know, offline purposes or whatever, you know, timeline purposes. But I see well, so first start with initial state, right? When you go to render the app initially on screen, when you first mount it, you need to know what it's supposed to look like. Somebody has to draw that first frame. And a lot of the app is just static stuff. It doesn't need to come from a load.
Yep.
Right? It's just, here's what we need to get the thing on screen. I'm on this page, this route with this whatever. And that can just be statically declared right on your components. And then in terms of any dynamic load, well, there's no reason, or rather to me, it's an anti-pattern to tie loading to UI representation, right? The shape of my UI does not define when I load things, right? The fact that something mounted, okay, well, that sort of does imply that I probably should have either preloaded the data, or I'm going to load it and show a loader while I'm doing it. Right, one of those two things is often the case, but it's not always the case. It could be the case that I'm remounting it and I already had the data.
Yep.
Right, you have the whole caching concern. So if it is the case that when this component mounts, I always want to load the data, well, there's a lifecycle method for that, right? React. There's stateful, you know, there's use effect. There are ways to say, I want to load this when I mount. But very often the story of when it loads and how long it's cached and et cetera, that's a completely separate logic story. Now, in terms of organizing that code so that it's easy to follow, well, yeah, certainly. You need to do some software engineering and decide what that needs to look like for your particular use case. But as a library author, I don't see any way for me to predefine that.
Okay. But it does seem like the current default, unless I'm once again misunderstanding how things are working,
Mm-hmm.
they do end up implying an implementation, which is the
more concrete.
yeah. Sorry. So for example, so things on upload usually, at least based on the examples I've seen, have to almost certainly be specified on at the point of mounting. Stuff that triggers on, say, actions that are user driven. So for example, things like login or them clicking things, stuff like that. That's a lot more flexible. Certainly I can see the rationale of these things could live inside UI state machines, or they could live inside, part of the kind of component fetch cycle or somewhere else.
So you're just talking like initial frame. How do I get my initial stuff loaded? Is that?
I mean, I think there's a or maybe it's less formalized, considering how sort of structured the rest of the kind of the guide and so on is.
Mm-hmm.
Less formalized as to where things should go for that kind of stuff, or at least
right.
Not
I've not shown as many patterns.
Yes,
and that is because there's kind of an infinite number of them. But in terms of what I would recommend, I guess I could do a little better job of what I'd recommend. So initial state is you mounted the thing. This is what it should look like on mount. And that doesn't involve any dynamic data. You've not loaded anything yet if you mounted the thing.
Yeah.
However, and this isn't spelled out well enough in the guide either. Loads work on app, and the app does not have to be mounted to load. I think the guide does show an example now. I think I added it of how to do that, because you do have to initialize the database, but you have to mount it. So you could have your static HTML show like Gmail does, right? Here's a picture of an envelope with an animation, right? Makes people feel like something's happening. And you could issue all of your loads, and as the final post mutation of the final load, mount the app.
Okay.
Right. You could do that, and then the app would appear with its loaded data. That is an approach that's perfectly valid. I think a lot of people end up thinking they have to mount the app before they load, so then they end up with, all right, put some ready flag. That's another thing you can do, right? Just put a UI ready flag here, right at the root, and and an if around it.
Yeah.
And that UI ready flag, that gets set to true as soon as you've initialized everything and loaded everything. And until then, you're just showing a spinner. Whatever. That's another approach. And that approach, you could actually mount it and have the client did mount, call back, do the, your initial set of loads. And then, of course, there's UI state machines. You could just start a state machine up and have it walk through, a sequence of things that need to happen and watch for what happens in between and connect the dots, etc. So yeah, the two rough primitives are initial state gives you a database to show the initial frame, and then load lets you load things. But when you load them, that's completely up to you. You can do it just about any time, and from any logic. And that's general purpose programming. I don't know what else to do about it.
Oh no, that's a fair point. I think certainly like one of the difficulties certainly early on was there's so much stuff that's covered. It's hard to work out what the kind of minimal set of things that need to be understood is to be able to get something working. I think that once someone sort of gets into their head, okay, this is all I need to actually understand to get something working, then it's a lot clearer as to kind of how to grow from there and what decisions are things that you can make from a kind of, you are the architect of this application, it's your choice as to what to do, versus, this is what the structure of the application needs to be for it to work. So yeah, I think, but certainly this has been really helpful in that regard.
Yeah. Query initial state ident. Make sure you really understand those before you write anything of consequence, because everything stems from those. Everything, data targeting, right? Load becomes trivial once you understand that.
Yeah.
Right, because you know you're going to be loading, right? If you look at the semantics of this, people often get confused by this. But if you say load app and some edge, right? You're really naming a root edge here, which you make up this keyword, and that goes to the server, and your resolver has to be able to resolve that. But from Fulcro's perspective, that's an edge from the root of your database by default. And then some component is the kind of thing that you're going to receive in the return. So the return is going to have to look like root edge, and then whatever data goes in component. Right, that's going to be the implied shape of this. And if the server happens to return more than one of those, well, then it's an implied to many. Right? The load doesn't know whether that's going to be a to one or to many. Your schema defines that. Your real schema of these in the database defines whether that's a to one or to many, and that has to be mirrored here, right? If you expect, sorry, not here. If you expect this to be a to many edge, then of course your UI has to use it as a to many edge.
Yeah.
So there is, that's probably the most difficult thing people run into, is they think I'm going to be loading some people, and they'll give their person list here. Person list isn't a person.
Yeah.
Right? You want to load a person here, and you want to target some component that happens to be a person list who has a people edge. And so as soon as you understand that ident's going to give you these two components of this target, and that's going to be some edge in the actual query of person list. Oh, let's give that the right. You're going to have some person list like that. Loading people, well, by default, that's going to put that as a root edge. And the actual content of the response is expected to be people, and then, person name, etc. And so the target is that ident, that edge. It's a tuple of 3. And so as soon as you get that, people think, oh, I'm loading a list of people, so I have to load person list. Well, if you're loading person list, then you better be matching up person list's query. But that's not typically what you want to do. You want to load some number of persons, one or many, at this edge, but then I don't want that to be the real edge. I'd rather this be where that edge goes. And so if you've understood those concepts, you've got the vast majority of Fulcro. The nuts and bolts of it are that.
Yeah, I think one certain point of confusion was not realizing that Fulcro dynamically determines what it does based on what it gets back from the query of the load.
It doesn't really have to make a decision. You have to make the decisions, right? So the query engine, when it sees a join, it looks at what's there. If there's a single ident, it assumes it's a to one. If there's a vector of idents, it's a to many.
Yeah.
If you didn't set up the state correctly and treat it the other way, well, then it's just broken, right? It just won't work. Because Fulcro is not trying to interpret what you meant. It's just trying to follow an edge. And an edge can be to many or to one based on what you reify in the database. You stuck it there. You loaded it. Your resolver returned the data for it. Merge put it there the way your data said it should be. And if your UI doesn't end up matching what's there, then it's broken. And it won't render right. But Fulcro didn't make any of those decisions. There wasn't a single decision Fulcro made there.
Yeah.
Right? You literally gave it the shape of stuff to merge and said, merge person at people, and you gave it more than one person. So it's like, oh, well, I better make that a too many edge. because that's what you told me to do with your data.
There's quite a lot of leaning actually on essentially Pathom in essence, right? Because you're kind of
The server, certainly.
Yeah. With regards to building much more heavy dynamic applications, would it be more intelligent, instead of kind of trying to handle that complexity and dynamism on the client side, actually just using sort of Pathom's client side implementation as a bridge, so that way Pathom client side can handle that kind of mutation management and complexity?
For which?
So, for example, one of the applications I'm writing is quite game-like. It's got quite a lot of sort of manipulation, mutation, and stuff going on, and that runs predominantly more on the front-end side. And then it communicates to the server, the minimal set of things that it needs to communicate, so the server can track what's going on. But a lot of difficulties I had trying to make that work came as a result of the kind of data that is getting back from the server needs to go through several series of transformations before it makes sense in terms of what gets displayed on the client. Whereas it seems like there's an implicit expectation that what comes from the server is passed through straight to the client with very little change. Or at least in the sense that the way that I was seeing it, that might not be actually the case.
Right. So yeah, there's two layers where you can do that. Or there's even more than that, but in terms of I'm loading something from the server, the kind of default and recommended mode is, you use Pathom. I mean, it's so easy to make a new resolver to make a new shape for existing data that there's no reason why Pathom can't provide the UI with exactly what it wants, right? That's one of the powers of having a graph query language from the UI, is the UI can say, I need this, and I need it in this shape. And Pathom has this beautiful property of making it really easy to make that shape, right? So most of what I do does exactly that. Like if I want a different shape, I did it 3 or 4 times yesterday, where I just made up virtual attributes that go and run queries and roll up data or whatever to return something the way I want it to look in the UI. So I don't have to do any computation. I'm just pulling it straight from the server. You could certainly make a remote, a Fulcro remote that uses a Pathom parser itself. In fact, that's interfacing with REST or GraphQL or whatever. That's exactly what you do. Is you have it, get the EQL and then do whatever communicating to those services it needs to do to collect up the result, shape it, and hand it back to you. So that's certainly a way to do it. I know Jarrett is working on, Jarrett Atkins is working on a Fulcro subscriptions library. And if you've been following the YouTube video series, I showed a couple of recent videos where I showed how you could, use Fulcro with, reframe as the front end. So you could get some derived, kind of what reframe shines at is derived state, right? Everything's derived, right? You have some data and it does all this, magic to make things be derived. And Fulcro doesn't do that. Fulcro, it takes the exact opposite approach. It's, typically you're going to cache this stuff in some way, shape, or form. We're going to say, here's the full stack story and here's where you put the data and how it's normalized. But in terms of derived stuff, well, in my experience, for most of the apps that I write, most of the derived stuff is either one, so fast to compute in the UI rendering that it just doesn't make sense to add any complexity on top of that. I've got a control in my production app that paginates, sorts, and renders something like 8,000 items. I just literally do it in the render of the method and it's plenty fast enough.
Right.
So you have to get to pretty good data sizes or complex operations before it even makes sense to add that complexity, in my opinion. But there are certain classes, particularly in reporting, where you just have a bunch of rolled up stuff and derived things and charts and what have you, and you just like to have some computation that runs and is cached somewhere, and you'd like to have some structure around that. So yeah, I've been talking with Jarrett and thinking about that problem myself. It's just I've had so little need for it. Like in practice, like I said, when I hit against this, it's usually so fast to either do it in the UI or to come up with my own simple caching mechanism for it, like picker options, like dropdowns. So in this app we're playing with here, if you go to invoices, and let's say we just, let's just make one, and we add a list item. This picker here, if I've added multiple line items, well, I want the same list of things over and over again. And this is actually stored in, I just made up a caching mechanism for dropdowns, for having picker options. And you give them, there's an options cache in the database, and you can tell it what cache key to use. And so here's all categories, and it keeps track of a cached at, and the API lets you specify how long you're allowed to cache this. And it just keeps them in normalized state. So every row that I add to this is using this same list of categories for this dropdown via this cache. That's the same sort of thing that you could do for, any sort of derived thing. And in here, again, this is just a calculated in the UI dynamic thing that it's plenty fast enough to do it here, and it's plenty simple enough to do it here that it doesn't make sense to me to add mechanisms on top of it that you need something like reframe 10x to even understand what's going on.
Right.
That said, I do recognize that for more advanced applications that have more of a graph of derived things, that model is quite useful for them. And that reframe, was aimed at replacing Flash apps. I wouldn't necessarily want to do a Flash app in Fulcro, right? I can kind of see I might actually look at using reframe for something like that.
Yeah.
It's all client side. There's a bunch of crap going on that's affecting other crap, and that's kind of nice. So I'm hoping here in the near term we'll have some open source contributors that add a library out there for Fulcro to use to do things like that more simply in a more declarative way. React hooks already give you quite a bit of interesting power in that realm. So I've made a few videos recently kind of around these concepts or these ideas of what could you do if you wanted some automated derived data in your Fulcro app.
Okay, thanks for that. So any other follow-on questions or new ones? We're coming close to time, so I just want to kind of see as well. It certainly sounds like I should have a chat with Jarrett at some point. Seeing as you're here, but you can't speak right now, Jarrett. This stuff is.
I figured out the mic.
Ah, hey.
Yeah, I use Reframe quite a bit when I'm doing dynamic application development and trying to work out how to get Fulcro and Reframe to talk together. So what you did then, that kind of bridging stuff is really helpful. So I'll be looking at kind of expanding on that stuff a lot more. I don't know what you've done like that.
I have a very proof of concept library published. I think I've got 3 versions of something like this sitting on my computer. The most polished one is on my GitHub, and if you want it, I'll send it in the Fulcro chat again. It uses hooks. You probably don't want to use it though. It's probably best for ideas.
Okay. I'll certainly take a look at it if you've linked it recently, or if you could just drop it in again, because this is definitely something that's somewhat near and dear to my heart.
Absolutely, I used Reframe for like 3 years until I camped on Fulcro.
Yeah, I'm a heavy Reframe user myself, but I needed something to handle the WebSockets and server-side story a little better.
Most people who have come to Fulcro from Reframe have that same sort of thing. Either it's usually something to do with either the normalized data store was too, like once the app got big, it was just too hard to manage the data, or the full stack. Like, I'm just reinventing all of this. Why not just use something that already invented it? But I do recognize that Reframe has some really cool tools, and it would be nice to to have some middle ground. And I've been talking to Jared about, I think because Fulcro has the normalization story and the co-located bits already and standardized to where a library can leverage those, normalizing your derived properties into the model, like using that as the cache. Whereas and I think in Reframe, you end up with a lot of the derived stuff is sort of hidden from you, isn't it? Unless you use the tracing tool. I'm not a Reframe developer, so like if you had a chain of things that were derived, seeing the middle one.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly can be. The system tries to, at a very high level, present you with a very, very simple low-level API. So a junior person working with it just has to understand how subscriptions and dispatches work. So how do I get data out? How do I send data in? And then everything else in the middle is just magic. And then slowly you can kind of get more and more to grips with it. So from that perspective, it's been pretty good because, I mean, junior developers on the team and so on, they don't need to understand a lot. They just need to literally know how to send stuff in, get stuff out, and they can kind of get to work.
Yeah, what I'm talking about is from the scalability standpoint of when you have a bug and you want to see what that middle value is.
Oh, yeah.
Or you're trying to understand why, like, you know, I know Wilker said part of the reason they moved away from Reframe for some of their software at Newbank was that, you know, somebody would go and refactor a bit of code and remove a load that they thought was just part of their thing. And everything would still compile, but then something would break, like some side thing, you know, over there would break because it was like this chain of things that you couldn't easily trace or reason about.
Yeah, that is definitely a problematic element in there. Is if you don't have a clear structure as to what you're doing, it is relatively easy to remove or like you know, break something from a kind of intermediary step. And that's a more difficult thing to manage. I think the current consensus is more around trying to leverage tooling like Spec to try and keep on top of some of that stuff.
Right.
But yeah.
And you can make a mess in anything, right? I mean, you could certainly get into Fulcro and pepper everything around in your lifecycle methods, and Lord knows what, you know, what's going where and what have you. You can make a mess anywhere. So.
So, I mean, if anyone else has any other questions, otherwise, thanks a ton, Tony. You've been really helpful. Anyone else? No? Yes?
Just a request for Tony to put the IntelliJ settings on the chat channel whenever he has a second.
Oh, yeah, I can do that.
Great, thank you. Thank you for being here, Tony.
Sure.
Yeah, much appreciated.
All right, see you guys in the channel.
Thanks a lot. And thanks everyone else for coming along and asking questions. Cheers. We'll meet again in sort of next week. There are probably fewer people, but yeah. Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Thanks as well. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.